Hello and welcome back to the Artisfy Codecast. Today I'm going to be going through a quick explanation of the 4 libraries I'm working on to help make Artisfy easier to build and more fun to build. Those libraries are the SwitchJS library, the CopyLayout JS library, and the outputjs library and the inputjs library. And the first thing I want to do is just go through a quick explanation of each. So to start out with, we have the SwitchJS library. The SwitchJS library is very simple. All it does is when you click on something, it's going to toggle something else. What that means is you might have a navigation item, a navigation button, and when you click that button, you want a sidebar to slide in. Or it might be that you click a button and you want a dialog box with a choice saying, okay, delete this or cancel to appear. That dialog box could be triggered by something like SwitchJS. Now, the benefits of a library like SwitchJS is if you're, a front-end developer, you'll very quickly realize that there's a library out there for everything. So there's a library for dialog boxes. There's a library for popping in your navigation. There's a library for creating menus. And if you import all of those libraries, you end up with a lot of code that you didn't write, that you don't understand, and most importantly, that is taking up a lot of space on your users in your user's browser. And that doesn't really, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't matter that much that you're taking up a lot of space. But the problem is that you're making their computer, or most likely at this point, their phone, process all of your code. And when you really look at how much JavaScript is parsed on a normal web page these days, it can take up to a few seconds. And it's really, in my view, unacceptable to make the user wait another additional couple of seconds. So SwitchJS makes it so that you can toggle all of these elements, right? And you just have to write the styling for them, which in most cases, if you're building a custom web app, you're going to want to customize how it looks anyways. So it saves you a lot of code, it saves you a lot of time in the long run, and it just makes it very easy to quickly kind of pop things in, pop things out. Okay, now we can see an example of the SwitchJS library here. I actually built this example a couple of videos ago, but you might see a web page like this, and it might have a little toggle in the top right, especially if you're on mobile. And when you click that toggle, you might get this kind of, navigation bar slide in from the right, and then it'll slide in and give you some options, here that you can click on, and then when you want to close it, if you want to stay on the current page, you can click the X. And that's something that, if you were using the SwitchJS library, you'd have to write the styling for the sidebar. Like if you wanted to have a dark background like this one, you'd have to do that. If you wanted it to take up the full height of the screen, you'd have to do that. But as far as the functionality, as far as clicking this button to make this, kind of activated, that you wouldn't have to write in order, and then also if you click outside of the sidebar, that will automatically close it. That's going to happen automatically with SwitchJS, and when you click the X button, that's going to happen automatically with SwitchJS. So it takes care of a lot of things for you. Now we have the CopyLayout library, and this is mostly to be used with the SwitchJS library. So you might have a component on your page that can be edited, and in a lot of cases, if you want to keep your web app pretty simple, you want to take the user to a different page, because then you don't have to deal with like special layouts, special screen sizes, modals inside of modals. You can just take them to a separate page, have them enter the information, click save, and then take them back to the original page. However, that's usually not a good user experience. The problem with that is it takes them out of the context that they're working in. If they want to edit a bunch of things in a row, it takes a lot longer to load up this new page and then send them back to the old page. And they might have information on the current page that they want to reference as they're editing this thing. So, how it ends up looking, when they type in some new value or choose a different color, how that looks on the page is going to matter to them. So they don't want to keep having to switch back and forth, right? So ideally, you want some kind of inline edit interface. And what the CopyLayout.js library does is makes it very easy for you to copy the height and the width and the position on the page of an element that you want to edit and copy that layout onto a new element so that that new element can appear right on top of it. Sorry, I didn't say that very well. Basically, say this is the element you want to edit. You click this edit button, and then this backdrop, right, is going to appear over the whole page. That's going to be SwitchJS. And then you're going to use CopyLayout to make this inline edit box, right? This is the box that's going to let you actually edit the data in the component, right? So if this has like a title here, and it has like a name here, an author name here, and it has a description here, you're going to be able to edit all of that in this inline edit dialog box. And this dialog box is going to appear right on top of the old component, right? So you can see that old component is right underneath it. And the reason why how you can do that, one way of doing it, is using the CopyLayout library. And if you do it with the CopyLayout library, all you have to do is attach a data attribute to this element, a very simple data attribute with 4 or 5 arguments, and then you'll get this functionality so that when this is clicked on, boom, you're going to get this to pop up. And again, you're going to have to style the dialog box, but all of the toggling, all of the, like, if I click outside of it, does it close? All of that stuff is going to be handled for you automatically by SwitchJS. And then all of the width and the height and the positioning stuff is going to be handled by CopyLayout. So those are those two libraries, and they work in concert, and they're kind of purpose-made at this point to help me handle inline editing on Artisfy. Because what I have on Artisfy is a bunch of projects that the artist can set up that a client coming to their website will be able to choose, oh, I want the portrait project. I'm willing to pay $300 for that. And the artist can specify, okay, we're going to talk through, the portrait and the idea for it, for the first, couple hours of the project. And then I'm going to get into doing some sketches for your portrait. And then I'm going to end up, using your feedback, to make a new version after that version. And so the artist can create these projects on their page, on their personal page, that help the client understand exactly what they're going to be getting from the artist. And in order to edit all of those details, all I have set up is a bunch of components that appear over the the projects that say, oh, you want to edit the title? Oh, you want to edit the timeline that you're going to show the client? Boom, here it is. You can just pop it right in and edit it right there, click save, and you're done with it. Now, one potential problem with this, and it's not really a huge problem, but one thing that I've run into a lot when developing web applications is that if you have a single component and you're say you're editing the title, right? So say this is say this component lets you inline edit the title on the page. So when you save this, it's gonna show up over here, right? So you can say like, oh, this is going to be called the portrait bundle. In that case, you have to, as a web developer, you have to talk to the server. So when they click save, you have to have what's called an event listener pick up that this event happened, that they click save. And then you're going to have to go into this little box and you're going to say, okay, what did they type in? And then you're going to say, was that appropriate what they typed in? You don't want them to just have something, where it's just like the letter A, right? So you want to make sure maybe that it's at least 3 letters, right? So that it's at least somewhat descriptive. And then you want to make sure that, it's not just a bunch of numbers. And so you can do some what's called like validation there. And then you find the route on the server that you want to send it to, the route that's going to accept this data, and you say, okay, hey server, like here's the data, and you send it up to the server, and then the server is going to do the same thing. So for that single piece of data, it's going to say, okay, which component is it for? Because for this example, we have 3 bundles. So we're going to say, okay, it's for this first bundle, okay, and it's going to say, okay, and what kind of data is it? And we're going to say, oh, this is the title of the component. And it's going to say, okay, since it's the title of the component and like this is normally specified by the route too that you call to the server, but sometimes it's not. But so you're gonna talk to the server and it's going to say, okay, now I'm looking for the title. I'm going to validate that this is a good title. Sometimes you'll just save it without validating it on the server if it's not that important of a piece of information. But in a lot of cases, it's a good kind of practice to validate it on the server. So then you're going to validate it on the server, and then you're going to grab the reference to the database, the object in the database. So you're going to say, I want this first component for this user, and I want to edit and insert this piece of information. And then the other thing you have to write on the server is like, okay, I'm expecting this type of data, a string, right? Like a set of letters in the title of this certain component. And so that's just some extra setup that you have to do behind the scenes. It's just kind of telling the database what kind of data it's going to expect. And so that's a lot of extra steps. There's a lot of extra setup. And so it's not like, I disagree with that, being good practices. Those are all good practices, right? You want to make sure that the data is valid on the front end. You want to make sure that the data is valid on the back end. You want to edit a certain component in a certain way, and you want the database to be, consistent, to have the right data in the right place. However, now here's where my output and input.js libraries come in. If you want to quickly develop a web application, very quickly develop a web application, you don't want to think about any of this stuff. In my opinion, in my honest opinion, there should be something where you can just throw it out there, just throw it up. And you don't have to care about, is the data valid? Am I going to be able to get this later? The key thing at this point, in my view, is that people, ordinary developers, ordinary people, are able to create a web application, create a website, send it to their friends and their family, send it to people that they know, reach out to people, and see if it's useful, right? Because that's the key thing. If you're building a web application and it has to be fairly complicated in order for it to be useful, and it doesn't do exactly what people are expecting, or exactly what's going to be helpful for them, the most helpful for them, you're going to have to go back to the drawing board and you're going to have to do all of this stuff again, as far as the data validation, as far as the the database, telling what it's going to expect where, as far as like the event handler that's going to say, okay, look for this particular bit of text in in this element and send it to the server. All of that you're going to have to do it over again, depending on how far off you were in your original guess about how useful your web application or your website is. So That being said, what I think would be really good for the industry as a whole is the ability for a normal developer, an ordinary person, to just go, who has maybe even limited programming experience, to go in, type out some code really quickly on the front end, create some forms really quickly, attach a few, data attributes, right, to that front end code, and then boom, everything just works. They don't really have to set up the back end. They don't have to do all of the database stuff. They don't have to do the validation, and they can just see, is this idea fun? Is it useful? Is it good to work on? Because too many people spend too long, in my view, trying to figure out the right way of doing things. And the simple fact is that there's many different right ways of doing things. And it really depends on what is your project, who's your audience, how, I mean, if you're building something for a bank or like for in the finance industry, that's a totally different level of security than if you're building like a fun web game that's not storing any personal information of your users. So I think that there's a balance to be struck. And obviously you want the best security that you can possibly get. But as far as like data consistency goes, as far as like, is this number, is this like, title a number or not? I don't think that matters that much in most cases. If you've created something useful, then of course that's when it begins to matter, because then people are using it. Customers, might be using it. People, your clients who are paying for it might become dependent on it. And at that point, I think it makes a lot of sense to go in and then make sure all of your, your little widgets are updating and validating appropriately. So anyways, long story short, I know that wasn't a short story, I'm sorry. But, to cut it short, we have these components, right? And the normal way of doing things is like this. So this second example is the normal way you would do it. And, it's not even, so, okay, let me show you what I meant by this example. So you'd have this component, you'd edit this component, and then you'd click a save button, and it would send its data to the server and save it with all of those extra steps on top of it, right? As far as the data validation and the database schema and whatever. But this isn't exactly true, because the fact is you have components inside of this. And each of these components actually needs its own arrow here. So if you have, 3 items inside of this one component, this is more, what it looks like. So I know this looks messy now, but try to imagine, of course, you only have to write each one of these once, right? Because, if you're a good programmer, you're not doing all of this manually, right? These 3 things, are repeated in the next component, right? Because you're going to have the same 3 things. If in this component the title and the price and the description are editable, then it's going to be the same down here, right? And you're going to have some code that says, okay, just look at, all the components, and if the title's edited in one of the components, just tell me which component it is, and then, just edit that. But anyways, this is what the data flow looks like, okay? So it's kind of complicated, right? For each component, you're gonna send a separate little bit of data into the database. Now, with outputjs, the whole point of it, and I'm sorry for taking so long to explain this, because it's really not that complicated of a thing. All it does is it takes all of the data on the page, on the entire page. So this is, oops. So this is so cool, right? Because, oh man, okay. So it's so cool because it doesn't matter what you have on the page, right? You could have another component over here on the page, another component, and it could be a different shape and size of data, right? It doesn't matter what you have on the page. It's going to take all of this data, everything, and it's going to bundle it up into one big pile, okay? And then it's going to send it to the server. And I'm pretty sure that for some reason this is like a super bad idea or something, but in the end, I don't really care, right? Because it's going to make my job so much easier. And it's not like I totally don't care, right? If it was insecure, I wouldn't do it, right? It's not that it's insecure because you're still on the server, or before this data reaches the database, you're still doing some amount of validation, and you're making sure it's safe, and you're making sure you're not just like executing code in your server that's going to potentially be dangerous, right? And then you're also making sure that the person who's saving this data owns this data, right? So it's the same steps you would go through here, except you're doing it for all the data at once. So that makes it really, really easy, in my view, to just create a bunch of different components on a page, bundle all of their data up, send it to the server all at once, and you don't have to worry about writing this incremental code. And that just makes it so that at the end of the day, you can write a page like this, and then tomorrow you can write another page that looks totally different, that has totally different data, totally different shapes, and it's just as easy to write. And then that is also going to be bundled up and saved to the server. And so you're not going to have to micromanage all of these little details, especially when you're first getting started. You can just kind of boot up a project and push it out there, see if it works, see if people like it, and then improve it as time goes on. So anyways, that's output.js. Now I'm going to show you a little bit more. So if we go into our this other mockup I made. So this is an example of input.js. So this is a pretty similar layout. So we have an example page, and so this page, we're in view mode here. So this is not for Artisfy's example, this is not the artist view. This is the client's view. This is like this isn't the editable view. Okay, so this is just what people are seeing when they come to the page, and they're not an editor or an administrator or an editor. Sorry, I just said editor twice. But yeah, they're just viewing the data. They're just saying, okay, this is a cool project. This is a cool project. This is the title, for example. Maybe this other component is like the price or whatever. So this is just an example of a page that might have multiple groups of multiple components. Now, if you go to the website and you're an artist, you would get this edit view. And the only difference is that this edit view has these edit buttons next to each component. And these other components below would have the edit button too, but I'm just kind of trying to keep the design simple and keep the explanation simple, so I'm not going to go into that. So each of these components has an edit button, and when you click on this edit button, we're going to use the CopyLayout and the SwitchJS library to pop up this Inline Edit element. And this can be as long as we want, right? Because with the CopyLayout library, we don't have to copy the width and the height exactly. It doesn't have to appear right above this element and be the exact same size, right? It can be the same width and the same position, but a different height, right? And so we're going to pop this inline edit component right above the old component so that we can edit it. And then we're going to type something in here to edit the title, and then say this element has a color associated with it too. We're going to choose the color. And now here's where things get interesting. So the input library, the input.js library, is meant to handle data input, of course, right? So the idea, if I can just quickly go back to the output library, the idea of the output library is that you attach data attributes to each of the items inside of each of these components. So an example might be, you might have like a data O key and then name, and then the name would be equal to a name, right? So you might have data O key name John. And what this would convert into, so that's, this step. So let me just move all this down. So in the, on the page, you're going to have in the code, you're going to have one of these elements has this on it, okay? And what this is going to convert into is something that looks like this. So it's an object, and it has a name, a key, sorry, of name, and it's going to have a value of John. And so we can see how we got that, right? So the prefix is data-o-key, and so we just look through, all of the elements and see, which elements on this page have data-o-key attributes, and then we use the next part of it as the key, and the key is name in this case, so we're going to use that as the key, and then we have a value here of John. So we have name is John. So we could have other examples here, right? We could have like, color, and we could have red, and that's just going to be represented like this, right? So this is how the output library works, okay? So if I'll just put this example like down here for now. So this is how the output library works. It's going to look through the whole page for these data-o attributes and compile them into a JSON object. And if you want to see an example, I'll show you an example really quick. So we'll go into here, and this is, this is the Artisfy page with all of the data. So you can see like there's like a bundle name, there's a select button, there's a price, but it doesn't have any of the styling. So this is just the data, and it's because I was doing a test for the output library. And you can see right here, I have an array of 22 items. And let me make this a little bit bigger for you. So we have an array of 22 items, and that's because we have 22 bundles on this page, okay? And that's a lot of bundles. That's a lot of projects on this page. And it takes 33 milliseconds to go through every element on the page and compile its data into this array of 22 items. Now, just to clarify, just to kind of, talk through this in fairness, 33 milliseconds is a long time. So you'll often hear in, if you're making a game, for example, that you don't want any calculations you're making to take longer than 16.66 milliseconds. And that's because, and I don't know what this calculation is exactly, but I think it's 1,000 milliseconds divided by 60 frames per second, right? So if you want, so basically, a game wants to run at 60 frames per second, which means that boom, 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 the images are flashing to make sure, to make it look like the screen is moving, right, in a game, and the screens are flashing 60 times every second. And that's the speed at which the eye won't really notice a change. And so if you divide 1,000 milliseconds by 60, you're going to get the milliseconds that it takes for a single frame to flash. And that's because 1,000 is 1 second, right? And then you have 60 frames per second. So 16.66 is how many milliseconds it takes to flash a single frame. And the idea here is that if you can do all of your work in your JavaScript at below, ideally below 17 milliseconds, you're not going to skip a frame. So for a web app, the reason you care about this in a web app, and not just a game, is that like if you go to, I don't know what website to go to. I guess Product Hunt is one of my favorites. So if you go to Product Hunt and you scroll around and then you click on something, right? And then you continue scrolling, you'll notice that everything loads pretty instantly. There's no like flashes. I mean, there's a little flash there, but that's not bad, right? And so you're just like scrolling around. Everything just kind of feels natural. But I bet you've been to websites that have so many ads and have so many things running on them. And maybe there's like a video ad and then another video ad. When you click on something, so like say you click on something, it's going to take it's going to feel like forever that it's going to load. And that's not the worst problem, right? The worst problem is that while it's opening, right, you're not able to do anything else. So you'll notice here, like I can click on something and then I can click outside of it and it's going to close right away. But on these websites that are so congested with code and JavaScript that they're running a bunch of stuff in the background, it's going to make it so that when you open something or when you click something or when you do any action, it's going to cause so much computation that you're not going to be able to get to the next part. Like you're not going to be able to do an action that's going to have an effect on the page. And in the worst case, that leads to the browser freezing and you having to leave the website altogether. So anyways, back to our our output.js code. So if you want to see a shape of one of these bundles, let's go into the array and let's look at the last one in the array. So in this example, we have a description of a deliverable. We have the description field. We have the name field. We have the price. We have the number of revisions. We have some information about the revisions. So each bundle has a major revision time, a minor revision time, some revisions explanatory text that's editable by the user. It has some sample images, and then this is actually where most of the data is inside the timeline items. So each timeline item has a text, secondary text, a size, and a type. And then you have, for this example, 14 timeline items. And then you have so 22 of these, right? 22 of these bundles. So in each one, you have the same data. And so yeah, that's an example of what you can do by just attaching data attributes to your DOM. So if you look inside of the elements, you'll see, so ignore all this other stuff and ignore that it's called data-x-type instead of data-o-type, because that's the syntax change we're making. We're actually going to change this so that it's O instead. Because the output library, we want it to say O, but on the current version, it's X. So we have data-x-key-major-revision-time, and so this will convert into major revision time is equal to 120. So that's going to output that object, right? And so that's really cool because then you can go, let's go up here, let's go to the title, right? And let's see, okay, what is this? Well, this is a DataXType. What is that? Well, DataXType objects can specify the location of their data. And that means that we don't just have to have, we can have the data be located somewhere else than in these attribute keys. And so we can say data-x-location key name. And so this is the name of the key. And then we do a dot. And that means, so a dot is it's standing in for a CSS selector. And this isn't a valid CSS selector, but in this case, this stands for the current element. So this means look inside the inner text of the current element. And I'm going to improve this syntax a little bit, I think. But for now, what does that mean? Well, it means, look right inside the text of the element and grab that. and then assign that to the key of name. So you can have a bunch of data inside your elements right on the page. And we saw an example, of what the data looks like, and it's pretty powerful. It can output infinitely nested data, as far and as deep down as you want, as much data as you want. These timeline items could have timeline items, all, multiple levels deep, and it would still work. Okay, so let's go back to our input example. So okay, so actually, one last thing. So let me go back to this. So this is unstyled, as I said, but we're going to have, this all be editable with a click. And the issue is that we don't want to, as I was saying earlier, communicate with the server, for every single little change. So what we want to do is, if we have a data attribute on the page that says that the data could be found here, then we want a library that allows us to take the data from our input area. So in this example, from our inline edit dialog box, we want to be able to somehow transfer that data back into the element. And if the data is stored in the text of that element, we want to update the text of that element. If the data is stored in a key, in a data attribute key on that element, we want to update that key. Okay, so for this example, if I type in a new title for this, and let's say thing1, and I choose a color here, say it's blue, then what's going to happen is, before I click save, I'm actually not going to transfer this data back to the page. I'm not going to update the page yet because we haven't clicked save yet. So what I'm going to do instead is, I'm going to take this data and I'm going to assign it as data o key name and data o key color, and I'm going to assign these attributes to the inline element, to the inline edit dialog itself. And so that allows us to have a temporary store of what the data is. And so the reason for this is that we don't just want, we want the user to have a way of going back. So just as we have this save button, we also are going to want to have, oh geez, I didn't copy that. I moved it. Oh geez. Okay, so I want to be able to have a cancel button too. So for this example, we'll have like cancel, right? And if the user clicks cancel, we want them to pop them down to, back to this screen, and we want this to be, their original title, right? So we don't want to update it for them if they didn't mean to update it, and we want to give them a chance to go back. So that's why we only temporarily store the data on this element, and then after they click save, that's when the magic happens. So I really don't like saying that, because I don't like anything being so magical that you can't understand it yourself as a developer. But it's pretty simple. All it does is, when you click save, it's going to grab the data that's on this. Oh man, I got rid of our the data attributes. So it'll be like data dash o dash key dash name equals, or I guess we don't have to have the equals. So it's going to grab the information from these data attributes, which is represented here by this object, and it's going to put them back on the element. And since this element here, right, so we can see that this title element, this is going to store its data inside the text of the element. So the the input library is going to know that. So it's going to say, okay, I'm going to take this data and I'm going to add it to the page. How do I do that? And so it's going to go to this element and it's going to say, hey, how do you store your data? And this element's going to say, oh, I store it as my inner text. And it's going to say, oh, okay, then I'll put the data there. And so then this updates. And then it's going to say, hey, how do you store your data? And it's going to say, oh, you know, I don't store my own data. And it's going to say, okay. So then what it's going to do, so for one element, for the title element, it's just going to have, we'll just pretend it doesn't have any attributes or classes on it. It's going to say, div, because that's an element, and then we're going to have like thing1, and then we're going to have the closing div. And then for the color, instead, we're going to have, a div, and then that's going to have an attribute on it, and then that attribute is going to be equal to a value. And so this doesn't seem too powerful at first, but, or actually, sorry, this element is actually probably going to be above this element. It doesn't really matter, but this is most likely how it's going to work. So like, you don't have to do it this way, but like so if like, say this is the, the color, right? So we'll just put like a class on this and say like color. This element here isn't going to like necessarily store its own data. The data is just going to be on the top level element. You could put the data on this element and it wouldn't really matter, it wouldn't really affect anything. But I tend to like having it on the top level element so that other elements inside of this can also know what the color is, right? Because the color might not be, might not mean anything, but like what if this is like the type, right? And then this is like a feedback type. Then the other elements inside of here might want to know that that it's the feedback type, right? And then like this color might be a different color depending on the feedback. But other elements inside of here, like say the status element, might disappear altogether, if it's the feedback type, or it might appear if it's the feedback type. You might want to do something else with other elements in here. And having the data attribute here means that in your CSS you can use this data attribute to style things. So you can say, okay, like if this parent element has this data attribute, and that and the data attribute is set to feedback, then let's give the parent element a background color of black. And so you can style your your elements and everything inside of them based on the data that's set in the above element. And that's just one of the benefits of using this data-o notation. Now the cool thing about the input library is it automatically goes through all of the data-o, the output elements that triggered the inline edit. So for this example, if I click edit, this inline edit dialog is going to know that this component right here, this one, triggered it. And so it's going to look through this whole component. It's going to say, hey, I have some data. Does this match what you're looking for? Are you the, in this example, are you the type element? And the element's going to say either yes or no. And then it's going to go on to the next one. It's going to ask it. And then eventually it's going to get to the element that needs to be updated, and it's going to update it with the right color or the right name. And then the final step of all of this, right, because now we have this data, right, the name and the color set on this component. The final step is that after we've edited all of these components, after we have done all of this work of changing our page around, now we can save the page. And when we save the page, we're going to output everything at once. So we're going to have the name for the first element, the name for the second element, the name for the third element, and the colors for all of those too, just all bunched up together using the library, the output library, and grabs all the data and sends it to the server. And I haven't decided yet if this step where we grab all of the data is going to happen as soon as we click save in one of these components, or if we're going to have, like a big save button above everything. And if you're going to have to click, that giant save button, it's not going to be this big, but if you're going to have to click, this giant save button in order, for all of the data to be saved. Now, the reason I don't like that and would rather just save it whenever you click a save button is that I think save should mean save, right? I mean, that's kind of obvious, but oh man, I lost my save button. I keep not copying it, I keep just dragging it. Oh man. Sketch is really acting weird lately. Ever since I updated my Mac to the Mojave, I don't know how you even pronounce it, but that operating system, it's been awful. Okay, so I'm just gonna, okay, that's where I move the save button. Yeah, it's been running really slow and glitching. I actually just reinstalled it and it didn't help. I mean, not the operating system, but I reinstalled Sketch and like disabled all the plugins, and it still didn't help that much. Well, it did help a little bit, but not, obviously it's still acting a little slow. Anyways, so I think save should mean save. And so if you click save here, as a user, you're expecting your data to be saved. You're expecting that you can close the window at this point and everything's going to be saved. So what I'm thinking is every time the save button is clicked on one of these components, I'm going to output, I'm going to update the data, on inside of the component, obviously, and then I'm going to trigger, an entire page save, right? And, like we saw in our other example, even when we have 12 huge components, it still only took, 33 milliseconds to gather all that data. And, while that's longer than I would like it to be, it's in an acceptable range. And, also, this is 22 huge bundle elements with lots of data inside of each one, right? And most of the time, there's not going to be 22. In my opinion, most of the time there's going to be like 2 or 3, maybe 4. So it's probably going to take something, more like 10 milliseconds, right? So that's definitely in the acceptable range. So every time you click the save button in one of these inline edit components, boom, it's going to grab all the data on the page. It's going to send it to the server. This is going to be replicated on the server, and you're going to have nothing to worry about. All of your components are going to be updated. Everything that's on the page, that looks like what it is, right? If it's blue, if it's red, if it's purple, everything's just going to be grabbed and put on the server, and you're not going to have to worry about anything else. And another thing that I mentioned actually yesterday that this helps you save time with is like, okay, like what if I go in here and I add reordering capabilities? Well, if I take this, element, the second element on the page, and I move it down here, I'm going to have some server call that's going to say something. It's going to be like reorder, or like probably like bundles/reorder, and it's going to expect some data, and it's going to expect which element, which bundle do you want to reorder, and we're going to say okay, the number 2, the bundle 2, and then it's going to say, well, where do you want to move it? We're going to say 3, and then we're going to have to think through the logic of, okay, so we wanted 2 to move to 3, so that means 3 is going to move to 2, and so let's make sure, we take that out of the array in the right place, or take that out of the order in the right way, and we have to think about how we're organizing all this data and grabbing it and moving it around. And it's not that hard to do, honestly. It's just, it makes you think extra, and it makes you have this thing in the back of your mind like, oh, did I do this right? And you have to kind of, keep double checking yourself and keep testing things. Whereas if you output all of the data at once, you don't have to worry about any of that, because as soon as you reorder this and then you output the data again, all the outputjs library is looking at is what's in the DOM, right? So it's going to say, hey, I grabbed the data in this order, right? And this is exactly what it's going to look like. So you're going to go, it's going to be 3 and then it's going to be 2. And why is it going to be like that? Well, it's because it's how it ran into it in the page. I ran into this component first, and then this component, and then this component, and then this component, and then this component, and then this component. And so it's not going to, worry about, oh, does this need to be reordered? Oh, is this right? Is that right? You're not going to have to think about it. It's not going to have to process it. It's just going to grab everything that's on the page and mirror that on the server in the database. So you're not going to have to worry, about how anything's being handled. So that's my explanation of why I'm working on the input JS library. I'm planning tomorrow or the next day working on it a decent amount and hopefully getting it finished very soon, because I'm really, really looking forward to building Artisfy using these, new libraries. Already the SwitchJS library has saved me a lot of time, and I think it's got a really nice syntax right now. I'm going to just really quickly, as just kind of a sign off, go into the current it's not this one, the current code or this current syntax for this input library. And if we look at this one, so this is what I'm thinking. So the component, the inline edit component is going to have this attribute on it, data-i-store. And sorry, I'm just looking at this syntax too, because I might want to change that. So anyways, the inline edit component is going to have data-i-store. A choice, so a choice is a choice element is something that that if you click inside of it on a, I think I actually might get rid of this choice element. I don't think I need it, that's why. I think that, yeah, I don't know, it might be nice to have it. But anyways, the idea is that, so say I have an element and it has data I choice on it, and then it has data I key, and then the key is like, type, and then the data I value is feedback. Then when you click on this, what it's going to save, so it's going to temporarily go to, the data I store element, and it's going to save the data there. Oh, okay, I think I know why I had the data I choice element. Okay, so anyways, it's going to save the data here. So we're going to have data O, because this is the output value. So we're going to have data O key type, and then that's going to be feedback. And if you're wondering, why I have this syntax here where I put data O key and then I have the name of the key and then the value all in the same attribute, but here I split it up into, two, where it's data I key, and then data I value. It's because for this one, I'm only ever storing one key on it, like an input element can't have multiple keys, whereas this output data, I might have this on the same element that I have another one, right? So I might have like two. Yeah. And so I think that the syntax is simpler and nicer, and I would use it for the output ones, but I need these attributes to be unique. Okay, so the idea here is that yeah, so it's going to crawl up to the store. But I think the reason why I wanted the data choice element is that I wanted to kind of separate the idea of the store, the temporary data store, from the idea of the choice element. So I was thinking that, say instead I would put this data choice element up here, and that would be the thing that denotes that it's the thing that gets the output. Whereas if it's on this element, then this is the thing that would get the output data, right? And I think that's right. I think that makes sense, because then the data I store is just, so it's no longer responsible for storing the data. It's just responsible for keeping track of the original element that triggered this input action. So the component that you're inline editing, this store element is going to be like, oh, okay, I know that it's this element. That's where we're going to send the data after it's saved. And the reason why I was thinking, oh, maybe the data choice isn't necessary is because I was thinking, well, we have the data key, so we could just make, if it doesn't have a value, we could assume that the value is, in the inner text, or, if this is an input element, we could assume it's the value, right? But, if it does have a value, then we assume that that's the value. And so we don't even need this. But I kind of like having this so that we can define, where is the data going to be stored for this choice. And so we can put it, here on the same element. We can put it on the parent element. I kind of do like that. Okay, so let's delete this. And we have the thoughts on the widget. And I'm going to delete this because, like I said there, I don't need it. And let's make sure we have all of these represented. So we have data store, data key, data value. Yep, okay. Okay, I'll just put like input elements, and then this like should go up here. And here we'll just say like this save button copies the data from all the data elements into the component that originally triggered the data store. Inline edit to pop up. And then we're missing one, which is choice. So I'll just say like when we have a data, let's just copy these. On the same element. This data choice element tells us where to store the data O key that's assigned when it's clicked. And yeah, so it gets kind of complicated. It's not my favorite syntax because what I was thinking also is that, well, let me just write it down here, I guess. So, so some elements, so like input type text elements will only have this attribute and not a data I value, because the value will be in their value. If the value, and then I guess like, I don't know, extra, I don't know what to say, but okay. If elements, okay, so I guess let's indent this, and then let's, okay, so we're gonna also don't add the value of input elements to any data O keys before the save button is clicked. Only save this data if it's a data I choice. If it's a data I key accompanied by a data I value inside a data I choice. And let me just quickly say like what the reason is for this. And I know it's a little complicated, and it's like, well, why not, right? Like, why not just update it? Well, so the idea here is that, so if we're typing in this input element, you know, why don't we want to like live update this data, right? This data that's attached to it. So like if I type in, you know, blah, 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 like why don't I want this to be copied, you know, over here? And the reason is that updating a DOM element is actually a little bit expensive, and we really don't need to edit it. I mean, we're already editing it in here, right? So it's temporarily saved in here. If I close this, you know, inline edit, and then I open it again, I can just leave that text there if it's not a new element that's triggered it, right? And it's going to be autofilled anyways, you know, with the whole, you know, input output library. So I don't really need to, yeah, I don't really need to save this data on the parent element. The only reason for creating these, you know, data O key, you know, attributes on the inline edit is so that it adds as it works as a shortcut, so that when, you know, like I was saying earlier, if I where did I have that? I think I was talking about it over here. But anyways, so like if I attach, you know, data-o-key-color equals blue to this parent element that's in red, right? If I do that, then I can use this in my CSS to show which of these is selected. But I can't do the same thing with an input, right? I mean, I guess I could, and there might be cases where, I want to detect, what's in the input, and then I'll do like a special, selector, like a wildcard selector, saying, in the CSS, like if there's the word, important in this, then style it a certain way. But I can't imagine myself wanting to do that right now. So I think for, just ordinary input text, I'm not going to update the data on the inline edit element at all. Okay, so that's all for now. I'm glad I got to think through that with you. I hope this was, somewhat helpful. I look forward to publishing this. I look forward to working on Artisfy using these libraries, and maybe if you're interested, reach out and we can talk about how to improve these libraries and maybe getting them so you can use them in your own project. Okay. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.